The hearing will come to order. We want to welcome the first and second panels, and I'll start with my first opening statement. And I recognize myself for 5 minutes. It has been no secret to anyone following our committee that we have been taking a very specific look at the regulatory climate in this country where it is imbalanced and unworkable. In doing so, I and others have been clear that while we advocate the maintenance of common sense environmental and public health protections, we also need to be careful about the impacts of government encroachment and that these efforts not discourage job protection and economic growth. Today's hearing is another step to appreciate these issues. To understand the final regulatory product and the economic impacts of EPA activities, I think it is important to appreciate the process used by the agency to get those results. Our hearing will delve into one of the foundational parts of EPA's activities, the work of the Integrated Risk Information System, or also known as IRIS. I have been a strong advocate for high-quality science that is objective and valid. Moreover, I understand that many are concerned about IRIS's activities on specific chemicals. I'm not here to defend any particular chemical. This hearing is not about specific chemicals. To truly protect the public from harm and negative economic outcomes, we need an unbiased process informing policymakers about the science, not policymakers informing the science. IRIS was created over 25 years ago to provide EPA with information to develop policies surrounding human health effects from exposure to chemicals. There is no doubt providing such high-quality science-based assessment is critical to EPA's mission. The question is whether IRIS is in fact fulfilling this goal or have results begun to develop to support specific policy objectives. From our subcommittee's perspective, we need to grasp that IRIS is the program making scientific assessments about chemical substances that EPA program offices use to set federal limits for various environmental laws, including the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Solid Waste Disposal Act. In addition, many states rely on IRIS data for their own environmental program purposes. We are honored today to have a collection of very distinguished witnesses, and I appreciate the time and sacrifices they have made to be with us. Among the testimony we will receive is from the administration and their view of IRIS and its role. I look forward to getting an update on EPA's 2009 reforms to IRIS, as well as where things stand with the Chapter 7 long-term recommendations of the National Academy of Science for IRIS. In addition, we will have insight on whether IRIS assessments are doing what they should. If states are finding IRIS work reliable, how much we should care about IRIS assessment impacts on jobs and the economy, and is there a better way for EPA to perform these assessments? These recommendations could be helpful as we think about more global issues affecting the EPA. I hope all members will use this opportunity to understand the process, discuss the integrity of the basic science assessed at EPA, and appreciate how and when policy considerations converge in this process and their impact on jobs and the economy. And I will now yield back my time and recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for holding this hearing today entitled Chemical Risk Assessment, What Works for Jobs and the Economy. Risk assessment is a critical component in the protection of public health and the environment. Without adequate risk assessment, legislators and regulators cannot make informed and wise decisions about risk management. EPA has a responsibility to manage the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, to inform the public, industry, and policymakers with the strongest and best available science on a variety of potentially hazardous materials in the most not political manner. In 1985, they established IRIS to help the agency develop consensus opinions within the agency about the health effects from the chronic exposure to chemicals. Currently, EPA has assessments of 550 chemicals. These assessments are utilized by the EPA to further their mission and to set standards to protect human health and environment. IRIS assessments can be used in regulations. They garner a lot of attention. In recent years, this attention has not been positive. In 2008, the Energy and Commerce Committee held a hearing in the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee on IRIS and a GAO report that exposed concerns about the IRIS program. At the hearing, GAO testified that there was a backlog of 70 chemicals in the IRIS system that need to be completed, but that only 4 have been completed in 2008. and half the 540 chemicals that were currently in IRIS possibly had outdated risk assessments. On top of that, there are hundreds of other chemicals that have been referred to the IRIS system but have not even begun the assessment process. I also note that since the hearing in 2008, IRIS has only released assessments on 10 additional chemicals. In that 2008 hearing, I expressed concern regarding the IRIS assessment of dioxin. If you look at the dioxin section on IRIS webpage, you see a timeline. It appears as though IRIS has been assessing dioxin since 1985. I asked questions about this assessment in 2008. Now, 3 years later, EPA recently released a statement that IRIS assessment on dioxin will be finalized in 2012. Dioxin is a compound that we know is very dangerous, far too prevalent in and around the district I represent along the Houston Ship Channel. Just outside our district, we have the San Jacinto Waste Pits Superfund site, which consisted of submerged waste pits from an old paper mill that were recently discovered to be leaching high levels of dioxin into the San Jacinto River and there into the Galveston Bay. Fish advisories have been extended to larger and larger areas, creating a threat both to the people who fish for food and for the large sport fishing industry in the area. Dioxin status as a toxic compound should not be controversial, so the fact that it's still taken additional 3 or 4 years for IRIS to complete its risk assessment is very discouraging. If the EPA wants IRIS assessments to be viewed as legitimately scientific and reliable, they must take steps to streamline their review and process to issue assessments in a timely manner so they're not outdated, or make the assessments clearer and easier to understand. The National Academy of Sciences issued guidance on how to improve IRIS assessments, and I hope the EPA witness can update the committee on the improvements being made in the IRIS program and what they intend to do in the future to correct the problems within the program. We need to restore the public confidence in EPA's risk assessment and chemical regulatory system, and the first step must be to ensure the integrity of EPA's scientific information and practices. I look forward to hearing from the testimony of all our witnesses, particularly Dr. Honeycutt from TECQ, who's from my home state of Texas, and we work with them, particularly on that dioxin facility in the San Jacinto River. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now, does the gentleman from Mississippi seek time for an opening statement? Gentleman from Louisiana? Having no other members present to seek time, I'd like to welcome the first panel. First of all, let me introduce the entire panel, then we'll go 5-minute opening statements. First, we have Dr. Paul Anastas, Assistant Administrator of the Office of Research and Development, United States Environmental Protection Agency. Sir, welcome. Also, Mr. David Trimble, Director of the National Resources and Environment for the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and Mr. David C. Dorman, Dean for Research and Graduate Studies at North Carolina State University. On behalf of the National Academy of Sciences, we have two great panels, and we again welcome you. And I'd like to first turn to Dr. Anastas from the EPA for a 5-minute opening statement. We've got a lot of members. You got time if you go over. That's not a problem. If it goes too far, then it might be a problem. So welcome, and you're recognized, sir.
Good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Green, and other members of the committee. My name is Paul Anastas, and I'm the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Research and Development of the Environmental Protection Agency and the agency's Science Advisor. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you here this morning to discuss the Integrated Risk Information System, also known as IRIS. At the EPA, we firmly believe that the American people deserve the best possible scientific information about the chemicals that they may encounter in their air, water, and land, when those chemicals may potentially affect their health, their children, and the health of their communities. We have the duty to vigorously study them and share what we know with our citizens. Every day, expert scientists and EPA's IRIS program work to fulfill that duty, providing this information by drawing upon the best science, both from the agency as well as from universities and research institutes around the world. The assessments that we develop as part of the IRIS program are scientific documents, not regulations. This is an important distinction. While the information they contain is useful in our agency decisions, it is also widely used by communities, businesses, environmental groups, and public citizens. For those reasons and more, we recognize the importance of maintaining the highest level of scientific integrity. when generating these IRIS assessments. That is why every draft IRIS assessment is made available to the public, to our sister federal agencies, and to the broader scientific community for their review and comment. The draft assessments we produce undergo one of the most rigorous independent peer review processes in any scientific field. This peer review process makes our IRIS assessments stronger. The comments that we receive are valued and addressed. This is precisely why we undergo such rigorous review. This is how the scientific process works. We also recognize that continuous improvement is what science is all about. That is why in May 2009, Administrator Jackson put into place a strengthened and streamlined IRIS process. This new process not only strengthened the scientific integrity of the IRIS program, it also shortened the average time frame for generation of IRIS assessments from 5 years to just 23 months. Since 2009, EPA has completed 20 IRIS assessments, twice as many assessments as were finalized in the previous 4 years combined. But our efforts to continuously improve didn't stop there. This past July, I announced a plan to further strengthen the IRIS program. Because our assessments are widely used in the decisions of state and local governments, businesses, and American citizens, we have focused on making them clearer, more concise, and ensuring that our methods and scientific assumptions are more transparent to the users. These improvements, which we began aggressively implementing in July, directly address the suggestions from the National Academy of Sciences and other independent experts. The NAS made 6 major suggestions to improve the generation of IRIS documents, and we are implementing all of those recommendations. Those recommendations and how we're dealing with them are detailed in my written testimony, and I'll be happy to expand on those. We will pursue continuous improvement, but we will proceed in a way that does not slow or prevent our ability to provide the best scientific information to the public. That is what the American people expect and deserve. We recognize that the only reason to deeply understand a problem is to inform and empower its solution. When we look at the information that's being transmitted through our IRIS assessments, information about what makes a chemical hazardous, that information can be used to design the next generation of chemicals so that they're not hazardous in the first place. We believe this information empowers innovation in the marketplace. Leading companies understand this potential for innovation and are pursuing it aggressively through the use of green chemistry. Green chemistry is the design of chemical products and processes that reduce or eliminate the use and generation of hazardous substances. By understanding the properties that make a chemical hazardous, scientists in industry and in academia are meeting environmental and economic goals simultaneously through the principles of green chemistry design. New life-saving medicines are being developed in ways that produce dramatically less waste through green chemistry. New high-performing materials are being invented to serve their purpose and then degrade harmlessly into the environment through green chemistry design. New products are being introduced into the marketplace that are safe for children and attractive to consumers through green chemistry. All of this progress is being made in sectors ranging from agriculture to energy, transportation to telecommunications, and cosmetics to computing. Companies across the American economy are increasing profits and enhancing competitiveness through green chemistry. That's the power and the potential of green chemistry. And that's why the lessons we learn from toxicology and the IRIS program are important for feeding innovation. In conclusion, whether it's through IRIS or our other cutting-edge scientific research, EPA is providing critical information to companies, entrepreneurs, and researchers so they can make new discoveries and develop new innovations, all while protecting health and the environment. That is the real power of understanding chemical hazard, and that is why EPA's IRIS program is so critically important. We will continue to improve this program using the best science not only to understand the problems of today, but to inform and empower the solutions of tomorrow. It's what's necessary for the environment, for public health, for the economy, and I think we can all agree it's what the American people deserve. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here this morning, and I'll be happy to answer any questions as is appropriate.
Thank you, Dr. Anastas. And I would now like to recognize Mr. David Trimble. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Likewise, take your time and get through it, and we welcome you here.
Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our prior work and recommendations on EPA's Integrated Risk Information System. As you know, the IRIS database contains EPA's scientific position on the potential human health effects of exposure to more than 550 chemicals in the environment. IRIS assessments are a critical component of EPA's capacity to support scientifically sound risk management decisions, policies, and regulations. In March 2008, we reported that the IRIS program was at serious risk of becoming obsolete because the agency has not been able to complete timely, credible, and chemical assessments or decrease its backlog of 70 ongoing assessments. We found that the timeframes for completing assessments were unacceptably long, often taking over a decade. In many cases, assessments became obsolete before they could be finalized, and were stuck in an endless loop of assessment and reassessment. In April 2008, EPA revised the IRIS process, but the changes made were not responsive to our recommendations. The new process was actually worse than the one it replaced, institutionalizing a process that resulted in frequent delays by enabling OMB to determine when an IRIS assessment could move forward. Further, this process effectively excluded the content of OMB's comments to EPA and those from other interested federal agencies from the public record. Concerned with these problems and the agency's lack of responsiveness, we added EPA's process for assessing and controlling toxic chemicals to our January 2009 report on government-wide high-risk areas in need of increased attention by executive agencies and Congress. In May 2009, EPA had made significant changes to the IRIS process. In June of that year, we testified that these changes, if implemented and managed effectively, would be largely responsive to the recommendations we made in our March 2008 report. Let me highlight 3 of these key changes. First, the IRIS process would be managed by EPA rather than OMB as the former process was, restoring independence to EPA. Second, it required that all written comments provided by OMB and other federal agencies on draft IRIS assessments be part of the public record, adding transparency and credibility to the process. Third, the procedures consolidated and eliminated steps, streamlining the process. Notably, the new process eliminated the step under which other federal agencies could have IRIS assessments suspended indefinitely to conduct additional research. As we have reported, we understand that there may be exceptional circumstances under which it may be appropriate to wait for the results of an important ongoing study. However, as a general rule, we believe that the IRIS assessments that are based on the best available science is a standard that would best support the goal of completing assessments within reasonable time periods and minimizing the need to conduct wasteful rework. While the May 2009 IRIS process changes reflect a significant improvement that can help EPA restore the integrity and productivity of the IRIS program, EPA still faces significant management challenges as it seeks to complete timely, credible IRIS assessments. First, EPA must continue to balance the need for using the best available science with completing IRIS assessments in a timely manner. As we have reported, even one delay can have a domino effect, requiring the process to essentially be repeated to incorporate changing science. Second, EPA faces long-standing difficulties in completing assessments of chemicals of key concern, those that are both widespread and likely to cause significant health issues. We believe that EPA must continue to focus on the best available science, obtaining credible expert review, and finalizing IRIS assessments. Third, EPA must be disciplined in keeping to timelines even in the absence of fixed statutory deadlines for completing IRIS assessments. Lastly, we believe that to produce timely, credible IRIS assessments over a sustained period of time, it will be important for EPA to maintain a consistent process going forward. We are currently reviewing EPA's implementation of its revised 2009 IRIS assessment process and its response to our previous recommendations. As part of this review, we will be examining EPA's response to NAS's recommendations for improvements to the IRIS process. We plan to issue this report later this year. That concludes the summary of my statement. I'll be happy to answer any questions you or members of the committee may have.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize for 5 minutes Dr. David Dorman, who's testifying on behalf of the National Academy of Sciences. Sir, welcome. You have 5 minutes, and take your time on the opening statement.
Thank you.
And we want to make sure your microphone's on, or it needs to be pulled closer.
Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is David Dorman. I am professor of toxicology at North Carolina State University, and I served on the National Research Council's committee to review EPA's draft IRIS assessment of formaldehyde. The NRC report was developed by 15 scientists drawn by academia, federal laboratories, state government, and other organizations. The scientists that served on the NRC committee were selected by the national academies and had a wide array of scientific expertise related to this effort. As part of the Academy's process, a draft of the committee's report was subjected to extensive peer review prior to release by the NRC. It's important to note that the NRC was not asked to conduct an independent assessment of formaldehyde, but rather we were charged with examining EPA's identification of potential cancer and non-cancer health effects, the toxicological basis for those health effects, and the way uncertainty factors were used to derive the reference concentrations and the quantified cancer unit risk estimates for formaldehyde. The major findings of our NRC committee were as follows. First, we found that the U.S. EPA was faced with the daunting task of compiling a complex and large toxicological database for formaldehyde. For the most part, the committee agreed that EPA achieved this goal. The EPA's draft assessment for formaldehyde was prepared using the agency's current format and approach for IRIS documents. Our committee found the EPA's document to be quite cumbersome and was too often lacking in clarity and transparency. We were troubled that previous NRC committees reviewing similar IRIS assessments for other chemicals had identified similar deficiencies. Third, our committee therefore offered a set of suggestions for changes in the IRIS development process that might help EPA improve its approach. In essence, we provided EPA with a roadmap for changes in the development process. The term roadmap was used because the topics that needed to be addressed were set out, but detailed guidance was not provided by the committee since that was seen as beyond our committee's charge. Thus, the committee provided general guidance for the overall process and some specific guidance on the specific tests and steps of evidence identification, evidence review and evaluation, weight of evidence evaluation, selection of studies for derivation and calculation of reference concentrations and unit risk. For each of these steps, there are underlying processes that would need to be examined and reconsidered. The NRC report provides further details on these recommendations. Finally, the committee recognized that any revision of the approach would involve an extensive effort by EPA staff and others, and consequently, it did not recommend that EPA delay the revision of the formaldehyde assessment while revisions of the IRIS approach were undertaken. In fact, we provided specific guidance as to the steps needed to revise the existing draft IRIS assessment. Models for conducting IRIS assessments more effectively and efficiently are available, and the committee provided several examples in the present report. Thus, EPA might be able to make changes in its process relatively quickly by selecting and adapting existing approaches as it moves toward a more state-of-the-art process. As a member of the committee, I have been pleased to hear that Dr. Anastas and other EPA administrators plan on implementing suggestions found in the NRC formaldehyde report. In closing, I'd like to thank all of you for inviting me here to discuss the NRC's report, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, and welcome. We'll start, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for the first round of questions. First to Dr. Anastas, you've been clear in the past that IRIS does not perform risk assessments. Rather, this is done by risk managers in the program office, and I've been trying to handle those differences. EPA's website, though, states that IRIS is a human health assessment program that evaluates quantitative and qualitative risk information on effects that may result from exposure to specific chemical substances found in the environment. If this is true, how can IRIS not be doing quote-unquote risk assessments if it has to distill qualitative risk information and quantitative risk information?
The elements of a full risk assessment have been outlined in a landmark 1983 NAS report that looks at how we have risk identification and characterization, dose response, as well as exposure. What an IRIS assessment is to be is looking at the hazard identification and characterization and the dose response. Until that information, which is powerful and actually fundamental to a risk assessment, is combined with the exposure models and the exposures that are expected and anticipated under a regulatory program or some other scenario, that is when it becomes a full risk assessment and is used in risk management. This is only the important, but only the front end part of that overall calculus.
Thank you. You did answer this question in the opening statement. I'm just going to go through three quick ones. You stated that in your opening statement that the IRIS office evaluates peer review recommendations, correct? Is that what you said in your opening statement?
Right. When we get any peer review comments, we always review them and address them, yes.
Do you write draft assessments and evaluate public comments?
We submit our draft assessments for public comment, and the public and the scientific community comments on those drafts.
Does your office decide what to include and exclude and what other changes to be made to its own work based upon those two responses?
Through an extensive and iterative process, we receive those comments, address those comments, and transparently show how we have addressed those comments.
Thank you. Mr. Trimble, what effect does IRS risk values have on the regulated community or the private marketplace?
Well, as Dr. Anastas has indicated, it forms the basis for many of EPA's regulatory decisions. For example, in drinking water standards, the information in IRIS will be married up with occurrence data, whether or not the contaminant's been found in water across the country, to inform decisions about whether or not, for example, to regulate a contaminant. So it is the building block for many of EPA's regulatory decisions.
But if the IRS assessment is not finalized for over a period, then what does that affect?
Then it's basically everything comes to a screeching halt, because the regulatory, the mission teams like the water office or air, they don't have the sort of the basic science they need to carry out their mission.
And then the private sector who might be preparing for this are?
Everyone's left hanging, waiting.
Thank you. And Dr. Dorman, I've talked about this numerous times in my years here on the committee. What is the value of a risk assessment value that identifies a level below a natural occurring background level?
So that is a dilemma for a number of chemicals that exist endogenously, and that my own opinion, and I think it also was echoed in the report, is that for formaldehyde in particular, those endogenous levels need to inform the assessment that's performed by EPA or other agencies. On a personal note, kind of speaking not for the committee, I think that that becomes a challenge, and that I think that oftentimes we don't regulate chemicals, or we don't consider the risk assessment in light of that endogenous background.
And endogenous meaning?
That's what's present normally in the body just from consumption of food or from metabolism. It's basically what your body produces.
So in the numerous years I've been on this committee and dealing with, we have water issues that would have endogenous elements in it. We have ground that has endogenous elements. So I guess for the layman, having a standard that is lower than natural occurring, cleaning the soil up and then you can't replace it with the same soil. The same soil is still higher than the standard established by this risk assessment. Is that correct?
Correct. That could be the case.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize my colleague, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess what IRIS is so important, and I'm happen to represent the largest petrochemical complex in the country, is that all the chemicals used properly are something that we really benefit from. But that's why IRIS is so important, because those beneficial uses, but in certain levels. And best example is formaldehyde, asbestos, and I'll get the dioxin, that we need those, but within used properly, and that's why our IRS is so important to do. I mentioned, Mr. Administrator, I mentioned in our opening statement, I was concerned with the length of time it's taken IRS to complete assessment of dachshund due to the presence of dachshund superfight in our district. It's my understanding that IRS is expected to release a portion of the final dachshund assessment in January of 2012. Is that correct? And can you elaborate very briefly on why this is a two-part assessment? Yes, sir.
One of the things that I did try to emphasize is that when we receive comments on an assessment, we take them extremely seriously, and we want to fully address all of these comments. We follow the science. The science is what dictates when we can release a final assessment. We submitted the dioxin assessment most recently and received comments on both the cancer portion of the dioxin assessment and the non-cancer portion of the assessment. It is clear that the comments on the non-cancer portion of the assessment are things that can be readily dealt with, addressed, and that we can move quickly ahead. The complexity of the dioxin cancer portion of the assessment are far more complex, and will not be completed on the same time frame as the non-cancer portion of the assessment. And that is based on the science and the complexity of the science and the scientific issues.
And this is not the first hearing that our committee's had on IRS, and it's an important program that has been subject to review by the GAO and the National Academy of Science in this committee for years. It's been targeted because of lengthy delays and because of sometimes the politicalization, surprise, surprise, in Washington, what should be scientific process. We saw this during the Bush administration when the OMB took over management of the IRS program and the pace of the assessment slowed to a crawl. The General Accountability Government Accountability evaluated the preview process in place in 2004 and raised certain concerns. Mr. Trimble, can you briefly discuss the concerns GAO had with the IRS review system that was in place from 2004 to 2008? And again, I'm trying to remember, obviously OMB reviews all regulations from agencies, but this is the first time I've seen that OMB would actually control the process between agencies for input. So I appreciate you, mentioning that.
Briefly, what we found at the time was we had concerns regarding productivity with the IRIS program, which we've talked about. At that time, one of the things that we noted in our reports was that OMB had involved itself and taken control of two key steps within the process, so that reports and IRIS assessments could not move forward without OMB's concurrence. And that was, I believe, when reports were being sent out for review and when they were being finalized. There was one aspect that dealt with productivity and EPA's independence and ability to control the process. But the other aspect that we reported on that was troubling was that OMB's involvement in comments were non-transparent, so that there was a lack of transparency to the public regarding what changes were being made and what those comments were. OMB brought in other federal agencies, and also those comments were not transparent, being deemed by OMB at the time as deliberative in nature. And so it was those two factors that we were reported on at the time.
And again, that's a different system that I think we're used to, and there are times that as members, if we lose at the agency, whether it's EPA or somewhere else, we'll go to OMB and talk about the economic impacts. And that's what OMB should be doing, and not getting involved in the actual assessment, scientific assessment. Dr. Dorman, I know you briefly described some of the recommendations from the National Science Made. Can you talk about particularly with the issue of formaldehyde?
So I think in the case of formaldehyde, we found largely that we had a number of areas in which we agreed fully with the recommendations or the conclusions that the EPA had in the IRIS document. We did have some areas in which we differed as far as our interpretation of the EPA document in light of the scientific evidence that's available. We did give the agency some specific recommendations regarding not relying on certain studies that we felt that weren't the best studies available for certain endpoints like sensory irritation and others. I think hopefully that addresses your concern.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, panel.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair now recognizes Chairman Emeritus Mr. Barton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus. Let me ask Dr. Is it Anastas? Is that right?
Anastas.
Anastas. Okay, that's good. I like that. Anastas. Are you a career or are you a political appointee?
I am a political appointee.
Okay. And you've been in your position since the Obama administration took office?
Shortly thereafter.
Okay.
Actually, it was January of
Okay.
2010.
Very good. I'm going to ask you a little bit different series of questions than the hearing, because my interest, while I share some of the interest on chemical issues, I'm very involved in the air quality issue. Does your office do any of the studies that relate to ozone?
We produce integrated scientific assessments on a wide range of national ambient air quality standards, including ozone.
Okay, and mercury?
Yes, all of those substances under the program.
And PM 2.5?
Correct.
Okay. Is there any other office within EPA that does studies on those similar to your office?
We work closely with our Office of Air and Radiation, and while we do the underlying scientific assessments of the kind that we're discussing, and IRIS and integrated scientific assessments, the Office of Air and Radiation takes those basic scientific documents into their regulatory process.
When the administrator is looking at tightening the standards on the various criteria of pollutants under the Clean Air Act, who makes the decision whether the study to look at the health effects is going to be done internally by your office or externally?
The process of generating a scientific assessment on these chemicals would take place internally, relying on a wide range of external studies, universities, research institutes, and those assessments are conducted internally and then put out for peer review.
Would there ever be an instance where your office did not do an internal study, even if the decision was made to do an external study?
I am not familiar with a case where it would be conducted completely externally. We rely on a wide range of external studies to inform our assessments, but the assessments that are fed into the regulatory process are constructed internally.
Is it your decision whether to do the external study, or the administrator's decision, or the deputy administrator's decision, or a kind of a collective all of the above?
The conduct of the studies are dictated by the needs of our regulatory and program offices, and they work closely with the Office of Research and Development to identify which studies are necessary to inform their regulatory actions, and then we proceed. So that is the process that's used.
I don't necessarily understand that answer, but I don't have but a minute and a half. So can you give me a definition that's generally accepted of what a premature death is?
One would look at statistically a life expectancy using epidemiological models, and in the absence of a particular effect, if you're looking at, for instance,
well, give me a layman's definition. I mean, my friends on the Democratic side, when we debate these environmental bills where we're attempting to delay some of the EP regulation, they trot out these studies, and they're usually 10 to 15 years old. They're usually external, and they all seem to predict 30,000 premature deaths a year, but we've never gotten a definition of what a premature death is.
A premature death would be something that shortens the otherwise anticipated.
I understand I want to know what the definition is. Is a premature death somebody who has a life expectancy of 80 who dies at 40? because of exposure to ozone, dies at 50, dies at 35. I mean, there should be some standard definition. Apparently, there's not. Premature death is in the eyes of the beholder.
The life expectancy would be shortened from what it would otherwise be. So it's not set at a cutoff point of how much shorter. That is a
Well, my time. Could you provide for the record a written answer to what a premature death is?
I'd be happy.
Whatever the definition is that your agency uses, I'd like to have it in writing.
Certainly.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes a gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Anastas, is that correct?
Yes, thank you.
Just a question. Who selects who does the peer review? Who is invited to join in that? Is that open? Tell me how that works.
Certainly. The peer reviews are done, they can be done, for instance, by the National Academy of Sciences. They can be conducted by our Science Advisory Board. They can be conducted by panels of scientific experts. In the case of the National Academies, they are selected certainly by the Academy. The Science Advisory Board assembles ad hoc panels for those reviews. And in each of these types of processes, there's a vetting for balancing different scientific expertise and ensuring that there aren't ethical or conflicts of interest.
When a draft is prepared and done, if there's conflicting opinions by the peer review, how is that dealt with? Does that appear in your draft assessment that there are conflicting reports?
The results of conflicting opinions are resolved within the peer review committee themselves. They can represent the different perspectives in their peer review report, and we would receive that report.
So is the public ever made aware that there may have been a difference of opinion before that came to you?
Thank you. What's a very important point that I should have emphasized is these peer review panels are publicly held.
Okay.
We receive public comment. The peer reviews are publicly available. So this actually one of the things that was emphasized by GAO is the necessary transparency, and that is something that is very transparent in this process, is the peer review.
When the peer review is being completed, once a final assessment is done, is that final assessment on track to be reevaluated? Is it a perpetual, continuous reevaluation, or if something new comes in, is that subject to being changed?
There are over 500 assessments on the IRIS database currently, and one of the ongoing processes where we seek public input, we receive input from our various program offices and regional offices, is input on what should be in the pipeline for highest priority, either due to knowledge of additional scientific information that requires updating, or a need to address actions that need to be taken. So that's how we inform how things get updated in what order. As was referenced earlier, this is an ongoing challenge, and why it's so important that we have increased the pace of these assessments.
Can you give me the difference between chemistry and green chemistry?
Certainly. Chemistry is the study of all matter and material and its transformations, and green chemistry is looking at how you manipulate the molecules, how you build them from the atoms up, so that they have a reduced ability to cause toxicity to humans or the environment. In the same way that we can design a substance to be green or blue, flexible or brittle, we can design it so that it's either capable of causing harm or far less capable of causing harm.
Well, when I went to college, you could major in biology or chemistry. Do you anticipate that we'll see green chemistry majors in our universities?
As a matter of fact, there are PhD programs in major universities, both in the United States and elsewhere, in green chemistry. There are degree programs in everywhere from the U.S., India, China, Australia, and the U.K.
If I have time, I'd like to ask Dr. Trimble a question, if I may. And I'm going to read a quick peer review committee. This was the NRC Formaldehyde Committee review. Just a quote here. It says, the committee is concerned about the persistence of problems encountered with IRIS assessments over the years, and the draft was not prepared in a consistent fashion. It lacks clear links to an underlying conceptual framework, and it does not contain sufficient documentation on methods and criteria for identifying evidence from epidemiologic and experimental studies, for critically evaluating individual studies, for assessing the weight of evidence, and for selecting studies for derivation of the RFCs and unit risk assessments. Tell me your opinion on that, what that statement was.
This may be better directed to NAS, since the, GAO has not looked or assessed the NAS study.
We'll certainly defer then.
Yes, sir. So what we mean by that is that oftentimes when one is trying to put together a database, when you're basically doing literature reviews, before you begin that process, you start to lay out a framework by which you're going to evaluate the literature. And so as you're starting to go looking at literature, you'll find, for say, a chemical like formaldehyde, there's literally thousands of articles available in the published literature on a chemical where if you search the database using a word like formaldehyde, you'll find. And so one needs to have a process by which you start to kind of weed that evidence down to a sub-selection of studies and then eventually key studies that you start to use in your assessment. And we just felt that EPA was not transparent in defining that process by which they would both identify what literature they were finding and then either accept or not accept certain studies and bring them forward in their assessment.
I realize I'm out of time, and if I may, Dr. Trimble, what I was wanting to ask was this. The conclusions in that Formaldehyde Review Committee seem to indicate that the same problems that were noted by GAO in 06 are still evident in IRIS, and I just want to know if you agree or disagree.
I will probably punt on this. This is going to be part of our ongoing review, which we'll be reporting on in the next couple months, looking at how the process has gone since then, and part of that review will be looking at the NAS.
That was a very polite way of not answering.
Yeah, I apologize.
Thank you.
Gentleman, you look back. It's time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for 5 minutes.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this very important hearing today, and particularly we thank the witnesses for their testimony. Mr. Chairman, IRIS, as we all know, is the foundation of our public health and environmental policy, and it should be reviewed periodically to ensure it is being carried out at peak performance. And so the witness's testimony today has been very helpful on this subject. I believe to properly evaluate IRIS's performance, we must have absolute clarity on the function of IRIS. Dr. Nastas, let me start with you. Does IRIS make risk assessments?
No. What IRIS does is provide important scientific information that gives insight on the hazards of chemicals and potential health consequences of various chemicals. But in order to have it be a full risk assessment, it needs to have the exposure component. So while this information is fundamental and essential, it is not a full and complete risk assessment.
So do you only make hazard assessments, or do you do both?
The risk assessments are done as part of the regulatory process in our regulatory office.
Well, don't you agree that this is a very important distinction between these two?
It's a tremendously important distinction, one that is often confused. Many people do view IRIS numbers as regulations, as risk assessments, and it's an important distinction that this is looking at just this element of the scientific information.
That's very helpful. Now, does IRIS make EPA regulations? I think we know the answer, but I want you to go on the record and say that.
While we know how important IRIS values are to regulations, they are not regulations, and they are not making regulations.
So could we say then that the primary work of IRIS is to evaluate and integrate existing scientific literature into assessments of potential hazard, which are then used by EPA program offices and others to gauge risk and eventually set thresholds for exposure in programs? Is that correct?
That is correct.
In a little while, Dr. Anastas, we're going to hear from Dr. Honeycutt of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. He will claim that the EPA's most recent assessment on formaldehyde calls into question the safety of exhaling. Dr. Honeycutt will state that using EPA's most recent assessment, formaldehyde in your health, in your breath, that results from normal body functions would be 5 times higher than the highest level of EPA would call safe. Was the IRS assessment asserting that this room is now unsafe due to all of the formaldehyde producers currently being breathed at this time? How would you respond to this assertion, and what are the implications?
No, the IRS assessment was not concluding, implying that that this room is unsafe because of the air that we exhale. The formaldehyde assessment was benefited greatly from the comments that were supplied by the national academies, and the comments that the national academies provided are being addressed to strengthen that assessment. But no, the answer is no. The assessment did not imply that we are at risk because of the air that we are breathing in this room.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank my colleague. I would just note to Dr. Anastas that in your response you said not concluding. Brings up my question about, are you doing a risk assessment? So that's the part of this whole debate that we're looking into. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Anastas, is the source of a study's funding an automatic disqualifier of the contents or quality of the research, no matter how well characterized or high quality such a study is?
The evaluation of a study is based on the scientific integrity of the study, and so the short answer to your question is no. The importance of the rigor of this study, the way that this study is conducted, are the important determining factors. With regard to such things as the peer review and peer review panelists, ethical and conflict of interest are considered at that point, for instance, for peer reviewers, but in the conduct of the study, it is the scientific rigor of the study.
Other than industry funded, please tell the committee what other types of funding exist for high quality scientific work.
I think there's extensive funding for high quality research provided by the federal government. Certainly a wide range of our scientific agencies provide funding to researchers to conduct on a wide range of topics, including toxicology, epidemiology, and these are important sources of funding, whether it's the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and of course the Environmental Protection Agency.
Has the EPA ever contracted with the private sector or intentionally obtained scientific research that was paid for by private interest?
I want to make sure that I give you an accurate answer, so I don't want to be definitive without checking all of the facts. What I will pledge to do is get back with you with a clear answer on that question.
All right. To what extent does IRIS rely on the scientific pronouncements made by other federal agencies or coordinate with them on their activities like NTP or ATSTR?
One of the things that we ensure doing is coordinate on what assessments will be done, so that we certainly wouldn't want to be duplicative or overlapping or redundant. We coordinate with sister agencies and not only which assessments to do to make sure that we're complementary in wherever appropriate, but also coordinate with them in our interagency reviews. Our interagency reviews are transparent and inclusive, and we rely heavily on the scientific expertise on our sister scientific agencies and health agencies as well as others.
Thank you. Dr. Dorman, in your opinion, has EPA's IRIS process evolved to reflect improvements in the field of risk assessment?
So, speaking for myself and not as a member of the panel, I think that there's been approaches have been kind of mixed. In some areas, IRIS has been more considerate of modeling efforts and things like that, which reflect more state-of-the-art. I think there's other areas in which the IRIS assessment program probably lags a little bit behind, but I think that IRIS does try to keep up, and I think the EPA should be recognized for trying to keep up with the science as it's evolving.
Are you familiar with other branches of the federal government that are engaged in risk assessment? And if so, do those officers employ best practices that could be applied here?
So I am aware of, I serve and do an advisory role on different aspects for the federal government, and I think there are some examples of best practices. Speaking on behalf of the committee, we did identify some of those best practices that we thought that could serve a template for the agency as they move forward in looking at revising the IRIS program.
How important is it for the American public that the integrated risk assessment process results in a reasonably correct assessment? And what are the practical consequences of an overly precautionary assessment? What are the practical consequences of an assessment that does not identify risk?
So again, I think it's, as Dr. Anastas pointed out, the IRIS program is not doing the risk assessment per se. They're trying to compile the data regarding hazard identification. But I think that's extremely critical for folks. And I think it's not only an issue of an economic issue, but it's also a public health issue where the public doesn't become alarmed over health effects that may or may not be present with a certain chemical. And I think that's another area that, the EPA IRIS documents do try to identify hazard identification, and I think it's very critical for the public that it's done in a well way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time expired. The chair recognizes that we've been joined by my colleague from Georgia, which I think he will.
I thank the chairman. I will waive.
He waives. I'll now turn to. You bet I do. The chair now recognizes the vice chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Murphy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Anastas, the EPA has a draft of the IRIS toxicology review for hexavalent chromium. Is that correct?
Correct.
Are you aware that in the May 12th, 2011, a panel of independent chromium experts has significant concerns with that draft?
I am aware of that peer review.
And is the EPA prepared to incorporate more up-to-date scientific research in that based upon the information that came from the peer review and other input?
We are evaluating that peer review. We are evaluating the comments and concerns. While no decisions have been made, it is the practice that I have stated, and I appreciate the opportunity to emphasize that we consider and we address the concerns raised in peer review.
Is there anything from your recall of that peer review study that sticks out that says it's something that raises concerns of a particular salient nature for you?
There's, I think that this peer review has raised a number of questions about the science that is currently being conducted and the potential value of that science informing the assessment upon its completion.
And you're aware also of the NTP study that doses given to test animals, are you? That's something like 5,000 parts per billion, but the National Drinking Water Standard for total chromium is 100 parts per million. And drinking water monitoring indicates that hexavalent chromium in drinking water is only about 1 to 4 parts per billion. I mean, these seem to be pretty radical difference in terms of information that's come out on hexavalent chromium research versus what's really out there. How do you evaluate that sort of information when you see studies looking at some extremely high levels and then related to what's really out there.
It is certainly, I will say, a traditional methodology that what is when studying the toxicity of a particular chemical, that you want to be able to get up to the level where you see a particular toxic effect, and sometimes these levels that are required are fairly high, as you mentioned, and then there's the necessary extrapolation. So this is not necessarily unusual for studies of this type.
But you're also aware drawing conclusions based upon having toxic levels can give us some misinformation. For example, a person can reach a toxic level of ingestion of H2O. But that doesn't mean we draw conclusions based upon that. And I just want to make sure that that we're also looking at these levels. I mean, what is the real risk? Because none of us want to misdiagnose and then mistreat the problem.
Now, this is the basis of dose response, and getting these dose response curves, the ability to determine at which dose an effect may take place or at a no effect level is the basis of dose response. And so this is something that I know that Dr. Dorman teaches in his classes all the time in North Carolina.
I've also heard our EPA administrator talk about dose response curves as being the way to look at that. Now, the Natural Resources Defense Council, I believe, suggests that chromium alloys pollute our soil and water supplies. But I want to make something clear. Isn't it true that there's no association between the use of chromium alloys in stainless steel and any pollution or illness? Am I correct in that?
What we're looking at in the IRIS assessments is the toxicity, and the one that we're discussing is the toxicity of chromium-6. In different matrices, you can expect different considerations, and that is part of the risk assessment, risk management calculation.
Okay. Is that chromium-6 something that's used in stainless steel?
I believe chromium-6 is used in stainless steel.
When it's used in stainless steel, I mean, stainless steel is also seen as containers for clean drinking water, surgical equipment, et cetera. Is that an issue that chromium is actually leaching out of that stainless steel and contaminating those things?
Nothing in this in the IRIS assessment addresses any of those risk scenarios.
But you can look at things outside of the IRIS assessment. I mean, well, here's my concern. If we're saying that that is a toxic chemical, but it's used in containers which are used to have non-toxic water and sterile equipment, is it correct then in saying that that chromium is actually leaching out and causing problems?
Oh. You are identifying extremely important risk management decisions and exposure factors. That is, those are exactly the type of questions that are
But you're not giving me an answer. You're just saying it's important. I need to know.
Well, what I'm saying is that nothing in this health assessment would address those questions.
I don't still have an answer, but I realize my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And the town recognizes my friend from Colorado, Mr.
Thank
Gadd,
you
for
very
5
much,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. Dr. Anastas, I want to ask you a couple of things I read in your written testimony. One is about this rider that was attached to the Interior EPA appropriations bill this summer that would have delayed all IRIS assessments until the NAS recommendations were adopted and would have required NAS review of additional draft assessments. Does the administration support that policy?
What I can say is that the effect of those riders would be significant. I believe that Mr. Trimble did mention the concern I think that we all share of making sure that assessments come out in a timely way. The result of these riders would be significant delay of perhaps as much as a year or 2 years. And an important factor to consider is during that delay, would the assessments that are in development be brought out of date? So the impacts of this would be significant and cascading throughout not only the development of the assessments themselves, but the use of these assessments in a wide
What
range.
types of significant and cascading
As was mentioned earlier, these assessments are important as a foundation for for different decisions and actions, not only in the agency, but by states and municipalities and industry. Would these assessments then be able to inform regulatory decisions or other decisions? The answer, of course, is no, because they would be delayed by these actions.
Do you think there would be an effect on public health or the environment by these delays?
I certainly believe that our regulatory decisions, that decisions at the state and local level, and decisions made by companies and individuals impact human health and the environment. And so, yes, if
Okay, your answer is yes.
my answer is yes.
Thank you. Now, thinking about it from the other side of the issue, the chemical industry and economy in general, if we had uncertainty in these standards, would that potentially also be harmful to them since they wouldn't know what was coming down the pike?
I think the lack of knowledge is always difficult and something to try to avoid, which is why we try to get this information out.
Mr. Trimble, GAO has raised concerns about the delays in the IRIS process, and you talked about that earlier, and what that would mean for the credibility of assessments. Would suspending all assessments and all actions on past assessments impact the utility and credibility of the program?
Well, I think as Dr. Anastas indicated, the impact would be felt most immediately by the program offices at EPA, as well as the states and others that rely on that to make regulatory decisions.
So there'd be a lack of certainty.
Yes, certainly there'd be a lack of certainty and predictability, certainly.
Now, in your testimony, you talk about the compounding effects of delays on assessments, and Dr. Anastas referred to that. Can you please explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, what we've reported on in the past is that when studies in the past have been suspended or delayed, what happens is that the science keeps marching, so that when you start to restart that study, a lot of the work has to be redone because there's new scientific literature. We've talked about evolving scientific methods, for example, risk, quantifying risk and things like that. All of those, the state-of-the-art practices change over time. So when you stop and delay, you have to catch up to what is now cutting-edge science to move forward, and that causes delays.
In your testimony, you mentioned that IRIS process reforms are not established in regulation or statute. Do you have any ideas for this committee about what we can do about that you'd like to share with us?
Well, with that, I'm politely demur on this. We're looking at.
I thought you might.
We have a report that's coming out by the end of this year looking at the implementation of the IRIS program since the 2009 changes. So we'll be reporting on that shortly.
Mr. Chairman, we'll all look forward to getting a copy of that report, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Hampshire. Oh, before that, without unanimous consent for Mr. Murphy to do a unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I just ask this letter from the Specialty Steel Industry of North America be submitted for the record, in which it states no hexavalent chromium is present in steel alloys.
That has been shared with the minority. Is there objection? Hearing no objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Hampshire for 5 minutes, Mr. Bass.
Very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you all for your time and interest in being here today. Dr. Anastas, OMB guidance defines, quote, highly influential scientific assessment is a scientific assessment that could have a potential impact of more than $500 million in any year on either public or on the public or private sector, or is a novel, controversial, or precedent-setting, or has significant interagency interest. Because the estimates support the agency's regulatory activities, including costly cleanups, are the IRIS assessments routinely recognized as highly influential scientific assessments subject to the information quality and peer review guidelines?
I think the important discussion that we've been having has shown that these assessments are scientific inputs into regulatory decisions. They are not regulations. They are not regulatory conclusions. The considerations for economic impact are important and essential and a serious part of the deliberations that the agency has, but these assessments are not regulations and should not be viewed as such.
Well, I guess then in making the determination whether an IRIS assessment is highly influential, how does the EPA determine whether more than $500 million worth of future impacts are likely?
the results of regulatory decisions undertake extensive cost-benefit and regulatory impact analysis. Perhaps the most important point that I could make on this is that while we are, through these assessments, identifying the hazard profile of these substances, in the absence of exposure, there is no risk. If there's no exposure, there's no risk. And so there would be no reason for risk management. And so while these are important inputs, it would be wrong to assume that because something has a particular hazard profile, it is necessarily going to trigger a regulatory action.
Is it possible that any IRIS assessment could later be incorporated in a regulation that has impacts of more than $500 million?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm all set, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Nestis, you mentioned going back to Mr. Barton's questions regarding how you define premature. Let's take a person with emphysema. We know that person with emphysema is more likely to have complications from an inhaled toxin, pick ozone. So if the person with emphysema dies at 74 because of a bronchospastic asthmatic event triggered by ozone, is he compared to the average age someone dies, say 82 for a man, or is he compared to the average age that somebody with emphysema dies?
So when we're looking at statistical population distributions, that distribution is going to have various susceptibilities, people who are particularly susceptible and people who are particularly resilient. So what we're talking about is average lifespan and how different effects would affect a population. So I would not draw that conclusion based on an individual because I believe that would not be a statistically robust approach.
Wait, you don't adjust for comorbidities when determining whether somebody dies prematurely because of exposure to a toxin?
No, I'm saying certainly susceptible populations do reside within that overall population.
But I think...
But I'm saying that I wouldn't apply it to an individual.
I can tell you that would be counter to what you would do. I'm a doctor. That's what you would do in medicine. You would account for comorbidities, knowing that comorbidities have a huge influence upon the body's reaction to an external event.
And I absolutely agree that in dealing with an individual, you absolutely need to factor in the individual's susceptibility.
But I gather that you're not comparing them.
Epidemiological calculation.
But I actually think that you actually could go to the VA database, for example, find the average link span for somebody with a certain level of pulmonary impairment, and you would find, yes, for this degree of impairment they die, and this degree they die at this age. But I gather that is not necessarily done.
I'm saying that in many of the epidemiological studies that are relevant to the discussion that we were having about decreased lifespan, that has not been the basis of those studies.
I got my answer. Dr. Dorman, and I didn't mean to be rude. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be curt. I apologize. Dr. Dorman, did you participate in the critique of this report, the IRIS report for formaldehyde?
Yes, sir.
Now, I'm struck as I just kind of quickly eyeball it. And I'm quickly eyeballing it, so you may tell me I'm totally wrong. Join my wife on most occasions. If lack of knowledge is a bad thing, misinterpretation of knowledge is even worse. As I look at the summary of your report, you say that the committee concludes the weight of evidence suggests formaldehyde unlikely to appear in blood as an intact molecule. You go on to say that the first, kind of absorbed, quickly metabolized, it goes away, unlikely to have a systemic effect. That's kind of as I scan what I'm getting. So even though this is 1,000 pages, I looked it up, it's a 1,043-page report talking about all the things it will do to rat urine and to male, to human nasal mucosa, really, all that strongly suggests there's pertinent physical effects, and yet your report finds that may be overstated. Is that a fair statement?
So I think it's a fair statement that the Academy concluded that the current best evidence indicates that formaldehyde does not reach the systemic circulation in an appreciable way. And so what we did recognize as well, though, is that formaldehyde might have certain health effects that may not require it being delivered systemically. And so, for example, if we have, say, rhinitis or an irritation in the nose, you might also have headache, even though that chemical never got to the brain. That would be an example, say, of a stress that might be associated with that inflammation in the nose. Where we differed from the conclusions probably related most to the mode of action that EPA was considering for the leukemogenic responses that have been associated with formaldehyde exposure, where we felt that the weight of evidence didn't strongly support their conclusions.
Yes, I'm kind of struck that there's 1,043 pages of stuff which documents, and if you just read it, you think, oh my gosh, isn't this terrible? Then I read your report, and it's when you actually analyze it and put it in context, it isn't quite so frightening. Worrisome, but not quite 1,043 pages of we've got to regulate. I agree with that. I'll also say, as a physician, it seems kind of routine. I'm not sure why it's taking you so long to implement these suggestions I put forth, because frankly, as a physician, if there's not rigor of methodology being explained, then the paper would never be published in a peer-reviewed journal. That seems to be kind of a standard sort of scientific method of presentation.
If I could just mention that this is a draft assessment. We put out draft assessments for the purpose of getting this kind of critique so that we improve it for the final assessment. This is what we do. This is why we seek it out.
Can I have just a minute more?
Gentlemen, without objection, gentlemen is recognized for another minute and a half.
Okay, thank you. Going back to green chemistry, that seems to me as if that would be the basis for a proposal regarding inherently safer technology.
Correct.
Now, that actually seems you've moved beyond, I think, Mr. Butterfield suggested your role as analytic, and I'll maybe paraphrase, analytic, not prescriptive. But that's a little disingenuous if you are saying, listen, we're going to make a value judgment as to whether or not this has a toxic effect and this does not. And frankly, there will be assumptions that credible scientists may disagree with your assumptions. And yet your findings are going to be the basis, I bet you, for regulation promoting inherently safer technology. How would you disagree with that?
What I tried to emphasize in my statement was when the information that we generate gives us insights, not only that an individual substance may or may not be toxic and in what ways, but how it's toxic. That gives us insights into design.
But you're making an assumption of toxicity that, again, scientists in a peer-reviewed journal would disagree with your assumption. And so, but yet your assumptions are going to guide this green chemistry, which is going to guide an IST regulation.
With all due respect, what I'm saying is not on the level of toxicity, but the mechanisms by which it has any kind of biological effect. This informs the design of the molecular structures of future chemicals so that we can minimize the possibility, the probability of various...
Give me a specific, because right now that sounds very nice, but as I try and think of the particular, it seems you can't divorce yourself from assumptions of the toxicity, and we already see credible dispute with your assumptions of toxicity.
When I am looking at a molecular structure, I know that whether or not a substance has the ability to even cause any type of toxic effect.
But water can drown. You see what I'm saying? Water has a toxic effect if you put your head underneath it for too long. And so you're right, there has to be a dose effect. And that's where, and there has to be a certain substrate in which it interacts. How do you account for that?
If a substance cannot be inhaled, if a substance cannot be respired, ingested, cross biological membranes, those are all based on its physical chemical properties. What chemists do is develop structures to control their physical chemical properties. You can design a substance to have those physical chemical properties so as to reduce the probability that it can cause hazardous adverse consequences.
So for
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you.
There's too many doctors in this room. The IQ has gone up, and I can't even understand the English being spoken here sometimes. So without asking, my colleague, Mr. Green, wanted to make a statement before we adjourn this panel.
Mr. Chairman, I know we have votes going to be scheduled, and I think we've exhausted our questions of the panel. I want to thank the panel. I know Doctor, you had to change your plans to be here, but when I referred to the Oxen facility in our district, actually in Ted Poe's district, but EPA worked in both administrations, both in 08 and 09, what I consider bureaucratic light speed to get that site on there, and we actually have it encapsulated now. In the next panel, I have our Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They actually are the ones that did the research to trace where all this dioxin was ultimately coming from in the San Jacinto River. So that's a great example. Most people get mad at EPA. Or in Texas, y'all don't think we do anything for the environment, but we do. Thank you.
And the chair now also wants to ask unanimous consent that the letter dated October 4th from the American Chemistry Council be submitted for the record. That's been shared with the minority without objections to order. I too want to thank the first panel. And for the second panel, we will convene you after votes. And they should be calling them within any minutes. So that's really is not productive for us to start, and we'll reconvene after votes. So with that, I'll recess this hearing. We'd ask our second panelists to, if they're here, to take their seats. We need nameplates placed up. Okay. Alex, make sure that's straight. His nameplate. And also, let's try to get filled up water pitchers for him at some time. I want to call the hearing to order so that we can get through the next panel and also get in between votes on the floor of the House. I think we got plenty of time, so but we do want to get started. We want to welcome you. Thank you for your patience. I'll do as I did with the first panel. I'm going to introduce you all across the board, and then we'll recognize you individually for your 5-minute opening statement. Because of the time that we have, I won't hold you strictly to the 5 minutes, so take your time and make sure that what you want to present is not rushed. So on this second panel, we again appreciate you all for being here. We have Dr. Michael Honeycutt, Director of Toxicology Division, Texas Council on Environmental Quality. We also have Dr. Harvey Clowell, the Hamner Institute for Health Sciences. We also have Mr. Jerry A. Cook, Technical Director, Chemical Products Corporation. It's good to see a Mr. and not all doctors. And then finally, Dr. Thomas A. Burke, Associate Dean for Public Health Practice and Training, Department of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and I'd like to recognize Dr. Honeycutt for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Michael Honeycutt. I'm Director of the Toxicology Division at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. I'd like to touch briefly on Texas's perspective on the science that EPA is using or not using for chemical risk assessments in recent years and the implications for regulatory agencies and the public. I've been a toxicologist and a risk assessor for Texas for over 15 years. In past years, we've had disagreements with EPA, but they've not really been based on science issues so much as on policy issues. An example of this would be that EPA does not want to consider TCEQ rules, which in many cases are more stringent than their cleanup values when addressing a cleanup site in Texas. However, we've always been able to work out our differences amicably. In recent years, though, EPA chemical risk assessments have become more precautionary in nature instead of relying on scientific data. The heart of the matter is that EPA is moving toward the philosophy that there is no safe level of exposure to a chemical, and this is contrary to the cornerstone of the science of toxicology. This change in philosophy results in unrealistically low regulatory levels, and as a result, naturally occurring levels of chemicals may be higher, in often cases is higher, than EPA's safe level. As an example, using EPA's most recent draft assessment of formaldehyde, the formaldehyde in your breath that results from normal body functions would be over 5 times higher than the highest level that EPA would call safe. Formaldehyde is naturally formed in the air from the breakdown of chemicals released from vegetation, and according to available air data, the only places that would have safe air would be remote locations such as the Arctic and South Pacific islands. In another example, using EPA's most recent draft assessment of arsenic, all fish and shellfish would contain levels of inorganic arsenic that are higher than the highest levels EPA would consider safe. And it's not just fish. Normal dietary food and drinking water consumption would also have arsenic levels substantially higher than EPA's safe level. And we just know this isn't true. We aren't seeing the health effects that would be predicted or expected in the general population based on EPA's new values. While we do agree with EPA on being precautious in areas where we don't have good science, we strongly believe that good science should not be ignored and should trump EPA's overuse of precaution. Hexavalent chromium is a good example of this. EPA's recent conclusion that ingesting hexchrome likely causes cancer in humans is based on a study where mice received extremely high levels of hexchrome. And EPA dismissed the human epidemiology and the wealth of other data that contradict this. And in those human studies, there was an occupational study where workers actually had yellow teeth and yellow tongues from ingesting so much arsenic. And TCEQ isn't the only organization concerned about the science behind EPA's recent assessments. The National Academy of Sciences, many prominent academic researchers, other states, and other countries have noted the lack of good science in these assessments. Because of the lack of scientific defensibility and the implications of EPA's new chemical assessments, Texas has recently decided to develop our own chemical assessments. We've written 2 state-of-the-science guidance documents and had them externally scientific peer-reviewed by panels of eminent scientists, including scientists from EPA, California EPA, and Canada. And we're in the process of putting our latest document through a second round of public comment. We had no desire at all to use our limited resources to develop these chemical risk assessments that we've historically been able to rely on EPA for. However, the implications of EPA's new assessments have forced our hand. EPA's new assessments will unnecessarily scare the public and may actually harm public health by diverting public, industry, and government attention and resources away from public health issues that may pose more of a risk. As an example, EPA currently encourages pregnant women to limit their consumption of fish due to concerns from mercury. However, numerous recent studies show that the health benefit from pregnant women eating fish outweighs the potential risk from mercury. If EPA finalizes their draft arsenic value as it currently stands, then the public, the media, and advocacy groups would perceive fish as being even more unsafe, resulting in even more pregnant women avoiding fish and its proven health benefits for them and their infants. There are also significant implications for remediation programs all across the country. Typical soil and water concentrations of chemicals, even some naturally occurring, would be considered unsafe. In other words, there is no safe place to live. How can you clean to below background levels if background levels are unsafe? All replacement soils that we would use to fill in a backyard would also contain these unsafe background levels. So where are we going to put all of this so-called contaminated soils that we'd have to dig up from somebody's yard? Your constituents will not stand for having soil and water that is deemed unsafe by EPA's new risk assessments, even if it is naturally occurring and we can't do anything about it. So these are just some of the issues that we'll have to face if EPA stays on their course, and I thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you for your testimony, and now I'd like to recognize Dr. Harvey Clowell. Sir, you have 5 minutes, and we're getting you fresh water.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. My name is Harvey Clowell. I'm a director of the Center for Human Health Assessment at the Hamner Institutes for Health Sciences in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. In my position at the Hamner, as well as in my previous consulting positions, I have performed risk assessment research and consulting for a large number of government and industry clients, including the EPA. I'm here today to present my professional opinions. I am not representing the Hamner or any other organization. I'm very familiar with EPA risk assessment practices. Over the last 30 years, I've assisted EPA on risk assessments for a number of compounds, including methylene chloride, cadmium, styrene, vinyl chloride, trichloroethylene, chloroformine perchlorate. I've served on the EPA's FIFRA Scientific Advisory Panel and the recent EPA Science Advisory Board on IRIS assessments for dioxin. I have also served as a peer reviewer for a number of recent EPA guidelines, including those for cancer risk assessment and risk characterization. I consider EPA to be a leader in advancing risk assessment methods and have been favorably impressed by a number of recent IRIS assessments for which I was a peer reviewer, including those for 1,4-dioxane and acrylamide. Nevertheless, I am concerned that the lack of objectivity and transparency in some recent IRIS assessments will impair the ability of decision makers to make informed risk management decisions. I'm particularly concerned that in some recent IRIS assessments, such as those for inorganic arsenic, formaldehyde, and dioxin, only a single cancer risk assessment approach has been presented, a low-dose linear default that assumes these chemicals are carcinogenic at any concentration. However, there is strong evidence for each of these chemicals that the true dose response is nonlinear, and that the default greatly overestimates the actual risk at current human exposure levels. This IRIS practice of presenting only a single approach disregards the recommendation in the OMB memorandum entitled Updated Principles for Risk Analysis to provide a characterization of the dispersion of risk estimates associated with different models, assumptions, and decisions. The OMB principles provide valuable guidance for assuring that risk assessments adequately inform decision makers faced with complex risk management options. Following the OMB recommendations should be a key objective of all IRIS assessments. The failure to objectively describe the evidence for alternative risk assessment approaches and to provide risk estimates other than the default has been a major deficiency in the IRIS risk assessment process. Even in the case of IRIS cancer assessments where alternative low-dose extrapolation options are discussed, there has been a clear bias towards presenting evidence that supports the selection of the default linear approach, even in cases where there is strong support for a nonlinear approach in the scientific community. Decision makers would be better informed by a balanced and objective discussion of both alternatives and the presentation of analyses based on both alternative approaches in the risk characterization section of the assessment. As a justification for presenting only the default low-dose linear risk assessment approach, the IRIS assessments have cited uncertainty in the evidence for alternative approaches. However, EPA guidance states that in the face of uncertainty, multiple approaches can be presented. The EPA's 2005 Guidelines for Carcinogen Risk Assessment state that, and I quote, nonlinear extrapolation having a significant biological support may be presented in addition to a linear approach when the available data and a weight of evidence evaluation support a nonlinear approach, but the data are not strong enough to ascertain the mode of action applying to the agency's mode of action framework. If more than one approach, e.g. both a nonlinear and linear approach, are supported by the data, they should be used and presented to the decision maker. End quote. In a number of cases, NAS and the EPA Science Advisory Board peer reviews have requested that the IRIS assessment be modified to objectively present multiple risk assessment options, but the agency has not complied. I believe that the repeated refusal of the EPA to implement recommendations from the NAS and SAB peer reviews to objectively present alternative risk assessment options has greatly delayed the completion of the IRIS assessments for a number of important chemicals, in some cases for more than a decade. In addition to being inconsistent with agency guidance, presentation of only a conservative default approach when there's a viable alternative provides the decision maker with an inaccurate characterization of risk that compromises his ability to make informed risk management decisions. In my opinion, IRIS assessments currently do not provide an objective and transparent characterization of the potential risks associated with chemical exposure. The inadequacy of the risk characterization in IRIS assessments, coupled with the sole use of conservative default approaches, hampers the ability of decision makers to make informed risk management decisions and gives the public an inaccurate impression of their potential risks from chemical exposure. I believe that this deficiency could, to a large extent, be addressed by assuring that IRIS assessments adhere to the risk assessment principles elaborated in the OMB memorandum and the information quality principles. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Cook for 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning.
We need to check the microphone. Either it's not on or it's not close enough.
Thank you. Yes. My name is Jerry Cook. I'm the Technical Director of Chemical Products Corporation, a small 78-year-old Georgia corporation which employs about 200 people in Cartersville, Georgia, which is in the metropolitan Atlanta area, on the fringe, I guess you would say. We are the last U.S. producer of barium chemicals, and I have been dealing with barium toxicology and regulation for more than 28 years. I joined Chemical Products in late October 1982 as Technical Director. The IRIS database is supposed to determine sound science concerning the toxicology of chemicals to guide EPA's regulatory activities, as we've heard today. If IRIS functioned properly, that could be used as a basis for sane regulation of various chemicals in the environment. Unfortunately, in the case of the IRIS barium file, I have found that the IRIS chemical managers and their superiors were not nearly as interested in sound science as they were in bureaucratic expediency. They simply did not want to hear sound science if it caused them to have to reevaluate the positions that they had previously taken. A brief history of barium regulation is as follows. In 1975, in the Statement of Basis and Purpose for the National Interim Primary Drinking Water Regulations, under barium, EPA stated, "No study appears to have been made of the amounts of barium that may be tolerated in drinking water or of effects from prolonged feeding of barium salts from which an acceptable water guideline may be set," end quote. They arbitrarily chose a value at that time based on the hypothesis that perhaps barium in drinking water could cause a small but significant increase in blood pressure, and that would be a danger to those already suffering from high blood pressure. That was a hypothetical effect that they derived from the fact that acute toxicity from barium salt ingestion does include heart effects, including hypertension, for the period of time until the barium is cleared from the body. The barium chemicals manufactured by Chemical Products Corporation are used in the ceramics industry to manufacture bricks and tiles, in the manufacture of luminous paints for highway signage and airport striping, and in heat treating of high-strength steel and the manufacture of catalysts. Many of our customers are small and medium-sized U.S. companies which are literally fighting for survival. Our customers tell us that the costs associated with RCRA regulation of barium are a substantial burden on them. In our efforts to change the RCRA regulation of barium, the IRIS determination of what was considered a safe level was cited as the reason why the RCRA regulations were not going to change. So that's how IRIS functions. IRIS is the basis upon which regulatory decisions are made. If the science in IRIS is bad, the regulatory decisions are going to be bad. The CEO of Summitville Tile, one of our customers, asked me to convey the following message to the members of this committee, and I quote, "The overregulation of American industry is making it increasingly more difficult for American manufacturers to compete in today's global economy. Summitville Tiles is a case in point. It is a 100-year-old manufacturer of quarry tile and brick products based in eastern Ohio. In recent years, it has had to close 2 tile manufacturing facilities and 16 distribution centers, laying off over 450 employees. Summitville Tile is today one of the last American tile companies to remain in business. In fact, it is the only remaining charter member of the Tile Industry's National Trade Association, the Tile Council of North America. With foreign imports now comprising approximately 80% of the U.S. domestic tile market, the last thing that the tile industry needs is more regulations. What is needed more than anything else is regulatory relief." End of quote. I think that sums up the feeling of many of the small and medium-sized manufacturers in this country today. As a small or medium-sized company, they are really not equipped to deal with unnecessary regulatory burdens. And I think that that is exactly how I would characterize the regulation of barium, because when a sound scientific study became available in 1994, when the NTP published a lifetime study of the effect of barium on rats and mice, IRIS greatly resisted acknowledging that study because it did not find the effect that was listed in IRIS. It did not find increased blood pressure. It instead found at much higher levels that barium would have an effect on the kidneys. But the levels to find that effect were orders of magnitude higher than the level that was promulgated in IRIS. Let me tell you a little bit about barium, if I may. Barium is an alkaline earth metal, one of the group which includes magnesium and calcium. It is not carcinogenic, and barium is rapidly eliminated from the body. In cases of acute barium ingestion, the effects are usually gone within a week. Barium is widely dispersed in the natural environment in the mineral barite, barium sulfate, which is insoluble in water and acids. Because it is insoluble, barium sulfate is not toxic. This is the chemical administered as an X-ray contrast medium for gastrointestinal X-rays, the infamous barium meal. I've never had one, but I understand it's not particularly tasty. Yes.
That's not on the record.
Well, doesn't it?
We have a number of doctors.
Doesn't matter which end you put it in. It works for gastrointestinal X-rays. If a large amount of soluble barium is ingested or inhaled, it is toxic because it temporarily interferes with the body's cellular potassium transport. EPA's IRIS database deals with chronic toxicity, which is a different situation. It's smaller amounts of a chemical consumed daily for many years, over a lifetime. There is no known instance of any chronic toxic effect in a human due to barium, and no animal studies were available, as I read to you, when EPA began regulating barium in the mid-1970s. When IRIS's database...
Mr. Cook, I did tell folks that they could go over 5. You're almost at 3 minutes over that. So if you can kind of...
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it very much. I think you've gotten the gist of my situation.
We have, and we'll follow up with
Thank
questions.
you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. Burke for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll put the microphone on. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm Tom Burke, and I'm the Associate Dean and a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. I also direct the Johns Hopkins Risk Sciences and Public Policy Institute. I served as a member of the Board on Environmental Sciences and Toxicology at the National Academy. I'm a member of the EPA Science Advisory Board, and I chaired the National Academy report, Science and Decisions, which really took a hard look at risk assessment practices at the EPA. Perhaps most relevant to today's hearing, though, is I've served as a state official. I was the director of the Toxics Program, the director of science and research at the New Jersey DEP, and the deputy health commissioner in charge of environmental issues in that state. So I worked closely with 4 governors on very challenging issues, responding to public health emergencies which ranged from water contamination to contamination of our beaches to food contamination to the cleanup of hazardous waste sites. So as a frontline health official, I can tell you that risk assessment is really important. We need information when things go bang in the night. And it's an essential tool for protecting the public's health. IRIS has been a part of that. So I'd like to address 3 points today. One is risk assessment itself as an important tool. Second is the IRIS program. And the third, I'd like to say a little bit about Science and Decisions and the National Academy recommendations to change the way we approach risk assessment. So first, as I mentioned, risk assessment is really important to public health officials, and it's used by not just EPA, but public health agencies around the world. I've helped most of our national agencies, from DOD to USDA, to use risk assessment. And as a state official, I have worked with other state officials in doing this, and EPA is recognized as providing most of us with the gold standards for evaluating hazards. Part of this is a tremendous use of the IRIS documents, but unfortunately there's inherent uncertainties, and as you heard from the panel, there are lots of things about toxicology and epidemiology that are uncertain, and they provide the basis for risk assessment. So for instance, does cancer in laboratory animals necessarily mean that exposure will cause cancer in humans? Or, more appropriate perhaps in some of the debates about IRIS, if you have 2 conflicting studies, one says you see a health hazard and the other doesn't, which one does EPA go with? And how do you make that decision? Well, there have been lots of arguments about this. There's lots of uncertainty that has led to a very polarized confrontation, as you might imagine. So I'm no stranger to this phenomenon called dueling risk assessments. An agency will present their risk assessment and their approach to a problem, and there's the opposite approach. And we have this situation where EPA is being called way too precautionary, and industry's risk assessments aren't listened to because they're seen as not being protective of public health. So the challenge before us is this process itself, how to be more transparent, meet the needs of decision makers, and break the logjam we now have. Now, the IRIS program, as you heard today, has a very unenviable task of synthesizing a lot of scientific information, and it appears to be the program everyone loves to hate. So they provide these very comprehensive overviews of health effects, and they weigh the scientific evidence, and it's very important in determining if we have hazards. Not surprisingly, this is controversial. They're the starting point for many of the agency's most difficult decisions. They provide insight into the magnitude of risk, but they don't tell us how to manage risks. I'm very familiar with the challenges of IRIS, and I actually think the NAS report on formaldehyde provides a sound roadmap for them to improve that. Now I'd like to finish with a few words about risk assessment. We've blurred the line today, I think, between risk assessment and the IRIS hazard assessments. Risk assessment is about decisions and should start with, as Science and Decision lays out, the problem formulation, making sure we ask the right questions, including the assessment that looks at the various options for control. And finally, with risk management decision justification, very important to this committee, is this decision justified, particularly in light of costs? So I think, just to kind of sum up, the framework that Science and Decisions offers perhaps can help us improve the application of IRIS and risk assessment in risk management and consider the very important considerations of economics and jobs. So finally, can risk assessments work for jobs in the economy? Well, in my experience as a state official in New Jersey, a clean environment is definitely good for business. Just ask the resort owners at the Jersey Shore or the businesses along the redeveloped brownfields and the Hudson River shoreline. Getting better solutions for environmental problems goes well beyond IRIS and should focus on advancing risk assessment to better inform our public policies. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Dr. Burke, and I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for opening questions on this panel. I want to start with Mr. Cook, because a lot of our focus here in this Congress has been on the effects of regulations on jobs and the economy. We do want to make sure that that's balanced, but we also, especially in the environment that we are in, we know that excessive regulations really are creating a burden. You've highlighted some of those burdens in your opening statement. If the chemicals you produce are not available, what substitutes would be made?
In some cases, there would be substitutes available. In other cases, I'm not sure there would be. In the case of the airport striping and signage, our barium carbonate is formulated by 2 manufacturers in the United States into very tiny glass barium beads, barium glass beads. Barium gives that glass a very high refractive index. So when light shines on a paint containing these glass beads, it glows. I think that's a major safety consideration for airports, and certainly it helps the visibility of highway signs. It probably has a safety impact there too. I'm not sure what material other than lead. Lead glass also has a high refractive index.
Barium would probably be better than lead.
I would certainly, given that, as I say, there really is no chronic effect to barium until you get to very, very high levels that are just not found anywhere in nature.
And let's just talk through this, also your opening statement mentioned, which is if we're not certain that the IRIS analysis is based upon credible, sound science, what effect does that have on you?
Well, for the past almost 29 years now, I have been trying to effect a change in the regulatory limit. And as I said, that regulatory limit was established back in the 70s when there was no data. Unfortunately, when IRIS came along in 1987, by that point, EPA had funded 2 studies. One found a slight, but they claimed significant blood pressure increase at low levels of barium in drinking water. The other study in EPA's own health effects research lab, giving the rats 10 times as much barium for a longer period of time, found no blood pressure increase. EPA chose to go with this study that found the blood pressure increase and said, aha, here it is. Once again, over precautionary. It was not a particularly good study. They recognized that, and yet they set their limits on that.
And there is terminology, abundance of caution at the different levels as a regulation moves forward, and I think you're highlighting that.
Yes.
Let me, Dr. Honeycutt, in your written testimony, you're pretty blunt. You say because of the lack of scientific defensibility and the implications of EPA's new chemical assessments, we decided to develop our own chemical assessments. Can you describe the scientific defensibility that you refer to? Because I hear Mr. Cooks talk about barium, and I'm not sure anyone, in essence, disagrees with that analysis, but can you talk about what you're referring to here?
Sure. There's no doubt that EPA comes up with safe levels. I mean, there is no doubt about that. The question is, can you have a higher level that's still safe or still just as safe? And that's where you have to get away from default procedures and actually look at how a chemical works in the body. How does it work in the rat versus how does it work in the human? And then at what levels are they exposed to? Because chemicals will exhibit different levels of toxicity depending on the dose. A good example is Tylenol. 20 tablets will kill you. 2 tablets will cure your headache. A half a tablet or a quarter of a tablet won't do anything to you. That is an adverse effect. So you have to look at those differences in dose.
In your opinion, is the IRIS program receptive to suggestions for program improvements to address this example you just gave?
Well, they actually have guidance on some of the things that we're talking about. The problem is their inconsistency in using their own guidance. They talk the talk, but when it comes to doing the assessment, they just revert back to their old precautionary selves.
Thank you. My time's expired. And depending upon how many people show up, we may go around a second time. I know there's more I want to address, so I'd like to recognize Mr. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Both houses of Congress seem to be interested in addressing the NIH IRIS recommendations, whether it's through strengthening IRIS or suspending it. And our colleagues in the Senate released a letter to one of our first panelists calling for suspension of IRIS assessments until the NAS recommendation can be incorporated. On the first panel, we heard from Dr. Anastas and the NAS on why such a suspension is not necessary and would protect public health. Now, with this panel, we're fortunate to have an expert on risk assessment who's quoted in that Senate letter. Dr. Burke, your quote is saying, "A sleeping giant is the EPA science is on the rocks, and if you fail, you become irrelevant." Would you explain that statement?
Sure, and thanks for asking that question. So that statement was made at a meeting of the EPA Science Advisory Board where we presented with the ORD vision for how science will be conducted in the future. And knowing the incredible pressures and having been on those front lines of applying science to society's problems, I issued that as a warning statement. Obviously, there's lots of criticisms, and the credibility of science is really important. So why is EPA in a crisis? Well, because of the incessant attacks on their credibility, not because they're not trying to put together the best science and not because they don't have a good science advisory board that provides them. But I think it's important to put that into context. EPA is under siege. The very mission of protection of our environment is being questioned, sometimes with good cause because of the economic considerations. But I think there is a crisis. There's a crisis in credibility, and that roadmap of improving IRIS will be a very important step toward addressing that crisis.
Okay. So, and you're familiar with the rider that I mentioned, and do you think that rider would strengthen the IRIS program?
I think, unfortunately, I think it would be a disservice to public health agencies throughout the country and even perhaps the world, and it would bring things to a halt in a way that would not serve us well.
Okay. It seems there's a difference of opinion among our panel members on IRIS assessments and what they should be. Dr. Honeycutt suggested in his testimony that the IRIS assessment provides EPA's judgment on how much a chemical can be in fish or apple juice for it to be considered safe. But these evaluations require assessing that exposure, something IRIS does not do. Dr. Burke, can you clarify the distinction between assessing the hazard and assessing the risk?
Yes. So understanding the hazard, it's like knowing, so this is anthrax over here, and this is bad stuff. It can cause a real problem. And it can cause problem at different levels. So it allows us to understand what the risks might be to people who are exposed. That's very different than the problem-oriented process of risk assessment that says, we have a facility here that has a problem and potentially emitting things into the environment. How do we evaluate what is acceptable in terms of a response to manage that risk? So the risk assessment is site-specific, it's population-specific, very different than just identifying the hazard and evaluating the epidemiology and toxicology.
So there's a difference between the risk assessment and what risk is acceptable.
Yes, and a hazard assessment will never tell you what risk is acceptable. That's a societal issue. It can consider social issues. There are lots of things that we don't regulate to very low levels because they are naturally occurring. And it is a policy question, not a science question, acceptability of risk. But understanding a hazard, that's all about good science.
Well, and we understand asbestos is a toxic substance, but you can go out in some places and dig up asbestos since it's a rock. And we know we can't prohibit it because it can be exposed by just digging it up. But although asbestos for decades was used very substantially to retard fire risk. So an assessment of the danger and also what could be acceptable if you encapsulate it and do lots of things, you can deal with that. Dr. Honeycutt, I want to thank you for appearing for the committee. And you've heard I've worked with TCEQ over years, and actually TCEQ actually alerted our office because for years we've had a height and dioxin level in Upper Galveston Bay and the Houston Ship Channel, and most of my industries were getting blamed for it. And there was some concern because we couldn't quantify it until TCEQ did. Can you tell us what efforts TCEQ has taken in regard to dioxin just as a substance? Like I joke, I want dioxin, I want white shirts, but I also know that I don't want to drink it. So if you could tell us what TCEQ in Texas has done with it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm very familiar with the San Jacinto pit site. We've developed our own policy-based number that we've used over the years for dioxins. And as I mentioned in my testimony, we're developing our own procedures for coming up with these toxicity values. That's going through that's been through a peer review, and that is out for public comment right now. So once that's finalized, we're going to run dioxin through our process and see what our number looks like. We're actively looking at that. I can't tell you right now where the number will come, whether ours is more or less, or higher or lower than EPA's, but we're going to be actively involved in that.
Okay. Is there going to be any conflict between when EPA is coming out in 2012, or will the TCEQs be earlier than, a year from now?
It won't be earlier than a year from now, definitely.
Okay. It'd be good to have two different assessments because one, that's how you get the what we can do with the risk. And also, I know I'm over time, but I appreciate your testimony that having spent 20 years in the Texas legislature and getting mad at EPA on a regular basis, we also recognize, as you said in your testimony, we sit down and can work things out. But sometimes we have to lower the decibel level to get there. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an erstwhile academic, so I'll speak to Dr. Clue and Dr. Burke because clearly, as I gather, IRIS is supposed to be here to use science to inform policy. The concern, though, is that policy is manipulating process and science to achieve an advocacy as opposed to achieving truth. Truth being the highest calling of science. Fair statement? I mean, that's, if you will, the question before us. Now, Dr. Clue, when I read yours, that there's clear bias towards presenting evidence that supports the selection of a default linear approach, even when there's strong support for a nonlinear approach in the scientific community. If I was co-writing a paper with a medical student and she brought something to me that had only one explanation, even though I knew that there was an alternative explanation which she does not address, I would give her a mulligan. I would say, you're a medical student, you need to learn to do better, bring it back, discussing the alternative explanation, and use this as a teaching moment. When EPA is using it to drive public policy, my blood pressure goes up. I must have just taken a boatload of barium. Because, why in the world are we making decisions that affect an incredible number of jobs on something which doesn't have a plausible alternative explanation? So you've made your point. Let me ask Dr. Burke whether or not you disagree with the point Dr. Clue made. But by the way, which is a similar point to what NAS made, that the neurobiologic effects of the formaldehyde could be attributed to other things which the 1,000-page document did not discuss. So, Dr. Burke?
I don't think we fundamentally disagree that EPA should present as comprehensive a picture as possible with the alternatives. I think we probably disagree in the fundamental mission of EPA, and in my testimony.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
Because actually I'm talking about not EPA, but IRIS.
Okay.
IRIS in a 1,000-page document, presumably presenting a comprehensive discussion,
right,
did not present a plausible alternative explanation that NAS came up with.
Right.
Now, this is not, industry. This is NAS.
Right.
And so if in a 1,000-page document IRIS did not discuss it, it has to beg the question, have they moved beyond have they moved beyond advocating science for truth to selective presentation of science to pursue policy?
Okay. Well, again, not being part of the IRIS program and not being part of that review, I know that the standard default that not just EPA but public health officials use, again, throughout the world, particularly for carcinogens, is the linear default, that we're not quite sure, because genetic damage can happen at very low levels, just how low that straight line might go. However,
now that I have to say surprises me, because we know that a 20-pack year history of smoking is strongly related to a risk of cigarette smoking.
Yes.
Something less as a threshold effect. And indeed, Dr. Anastas spoke about how, I have it written down here someplace, and of course I've lost it, that they look for a dose-related effect.
Yes.
So that would be a nonlinear effect. I'm not sure why we're still mired in something conceived of 3 decades ago as defining how we should approach a problem in this year.
Well, I think it's the strength of evidence. And when we're looking at hormonal effects, when we're looking at neurological effects on the unborn, the fundamental question is, a very important one, shouldn't we present the whole picture, what the alternatives might be? But that may not change the public health decision that where there is uncertainty, we have to make decisions.
But my concern is apparently they are not presenting the whole picture, which in effect skews
that's where I think we agree.
Skews the assumptions. Dr. Clue, I'm going to let you I'm speaking for you. Could you speak for yourself? Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I'm particularly troubled because I worked closely with William Farland when they were developing the cancer guidelines, trying to change from the old way of doing things with just a default. And the cancer guidelines was important because it was the first time that priority was given to a chemical-specific decision that did not rely on the default, and a justification was required that there was insufficient data to support using a default. But in recent years, there's been use of 1968 guidelines. It's a default. They don't demonstrate a balanced presentation of the different alternatives that are being discussed in the scientific community. They paint a picture of evidence supporting the default.
That is either suggesting incompetence or it's suggesting the pursuit of a political agenda.
Absolutely not incompetence. They're very competent people. I believe that they are public health professionals who are very concerned about public health and want to make sure they are conservative, and in trying to make sure that the protection is provided, they may not provide complete descriptions of alternative approaches that would generate a lower risk estimate.
That is a patronizing approach to the use of truth in science. And I, as a person who's sitting on here trying to make an informed decision, am offended that they assume I don't have the intellectual firepower to figure it out. And that's a disservice to the American people.
Actually, the Office of Water has the same problem. They're pretty much hamstrung by the arsenic risk assessment and decisions they would like to make. Like saying you don't have to clean up the entire western country of arsenic in soil, and river water are difficult to make when there's only a linear risk estimate.
I agree with Dr. Burke that there is indeed a threat to IRIS's reputation, and I think we're seeing it in terms of an uncovering of how they present facts. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time for the sake of getting my colleagues angry at me, and I'd like to go to a second round. I think the panel is well informed. I think we're learning a lot. The risk will be more members may come back, which might hold you a little bit longer. But I'd like to go a second round if that's okay with our guest and my colleagues here. If no objection, then so ordered, we'll go to a second round, 5 minutes each. And I may not take my whole 5 minutes, but with that, I'll recognize myself. And this is just a great debate. My concern is overabundance of caution at IRIS and then overabundance of caution at EPA with the policymakers could create job loss, economic dislocation, and movement of production overseas. So we got to get the science right. And I don't question the public health officials' intent to protect human health. I do agree that this debate on dosage and what is really harmful is very, very important. So with that, Dr. Burke, I want to address this one question on the delay, Because the question is, what would you deem more harmful to human health and the economy? A 1 or 2 year delay in an assessment that would ensure the scientific robustness of the result, or an assessment based on poor processes that is pushed through with questionable science?
Well, I think we owe it to the American public. I think we owe it to the scientific community to use the data appropriately and to synthesize the scientific information to inform decisions. However, having been in emergency situations where the data wasn't perfect, for instance, the trailers in Louisiana where the data on formaldehyde were not perfect, I worked with the CDC to try and make sure we didn't have acute exposures. So sometimes in public health we have imperfect information. However, I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that it would be better to do it right than to destroy the credibility of the process.
And that's this whole debate from the Senate, from what we did on the rider, to say let the National Academy of Sciences report be followed before we continue to move forward, just so we get it right. But I understand the great thing about a lot of things we do in this committee and on our health subcommittee is that people in this arena are public servants, want to do things right. But again, we wanted to raise that issue. To Dr. Honeycutt, I raised this in maybe my opening statement or the first round. We've talked about it before, and we just mentioned it with the water and arsenic in the Southwest. I remember it well because one of my colleagues, Heather Wilson, always talked about that. Arsenic levels in drinking water, although it's naturally occurring. So with that, this question, in your opinion, are there broader economic consequences associated with publishing an IRIS value that is lower than background levels? And if so, what impact do you feel it has on the jobs and the economy?
Oh, absolutely, there's an impact. Two real quick examples. One is mercury. EPA is actually, they're outliers from the rest of the world in what is a safe level of mercury in fish. All other regulatory agencies have higher safe levels. And that came home to Texas just a few weeks ago.
Is that true in the European standards?
Yes, the World Health Organization has a higher level, safe level for mercury in fish than EPA does.
It's funny, I never hear my colleagues mention that when we debate that issue. So,
but Lumina Energy laid off 500 people just a couple of weeks ago. So it does have direct or indirect, it depends on how you look at it, economic consequences. And another example is the arsenic that you're talking about. In Texas, there are a lot of really small locally owned utilities that won't be able to meet this, so they're going to close down. And so people then will have to drill their own water wells. And that's a real public health concern because that water won't be tested or monitored, and they're going to be at their own risk, that the public water systems won't be able to provide that level of safety.
And let me just finish by this. Mr. Cook talked about barium quite a bit, his analysis and his response. His statements on barium and the health risk, and I kind of assumed everyone sort of agreed with that analysis. Is that, can you go on record saying you agree with Mr. Cook on his analysis on barium?
Yes, sir. Barium, in the grand scheme of things, is not a very toxic chemical at all.
Dr. Clowell?
Yes, I agree.
Dr. Burke?
I really don't know the issue. I'll have
That's fine. That's fine. I just wanted to, and that's why I wanted to clarify, because I did make an assumption. I didn't want to do that. So I'm going to yield back 18 seconds and ask my colleague, Mr. Green, to be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Burke, and listening to my colleague from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, and I think your comments sounds like it blurs the line between the missions of IRIS, which is to assess the risk, and not the issue of regulations, which is the management of that risk, which is EPA's job. I guess there may be some concern that by the assessment from IRIS, it may raise the level of concern, but, like we've heard from Dr. Honeycutt, IRIS is supposed to give the assessment, but the risk is a EPA decision and not necessarily what may be coming out of the study. For example, the water, obviously water we need for our livelihood, but if you take it from a water hose or a fire hose, you're going to drown. And so there is a reasonable amount that you can have it's necessary, but it's, you know, too much of anything is bad. So that's what Dr. Burke, naturally occurring levels of chemicals, they're not always safe. Good example of arsenic in water. I can tell you in West Texas and all over the West, there are water holes or water that people should not drink and know they shouldn't drink because of whatever the chemicals in there that naturally occurring. So just because they're naturally occurring doesn't mean it's safe. You just have to have a certain level of it, I guess, to keep it to. And is that something we're continue to confuse, the difference between assessment and risk?
Well, it's a very important point. We can't possibly clean up the Earth's crust, nor can we regulate volcanoes for spewing mercury. And we have this naturally occurring materials, and we have to balance that in decision making. On the other hand, what we know about arsenic comes from actually naturally occurring contaminated wells in other parts of the world where people drank very high amounts and had acute effects as well as cancer effects. And so it comes down to being reasonable about how we approach regulation with the right information on the public health effects to help us make those decisions.
Okay. I know, you know, and I've announced where I come from. I have the biggest petrochemical complex in the world in our district, or in the country, second largest in the world. And so I guess my focus is on the relationship. Dr. Burke is a former state regulator, and you've seen that the risk assessment and effective risk management, what effect can it have on the jobs? Every product we make in the Houston Ship Channel, it wouldn't be made if somebody didn't need it. I mean, industries don't do that. They don't make any money on it. But so someone needs it, but it depends on how you make it and how that product is used in, you know, whether it be in gasoline or some other additive or something else. But is there a direct correlation between effective risk management and the impact on jobs and the economy, which is, I think, what the whole subcommittee was getting after?
I think that's a very important point in major regulatory decisions. I'm not an economist. I can only speak from experience. And clearly there are regulations that have added cost to industry and therefore may impact jobs and may impact the general public as well. But as we recommended in Science and Decisions, that should be part of the deal in conducting the assessment to make sure you're making the right risk management choice. That doesn't change what happens in the epidemiologic studies or in the mice. But we can take that data, and if it's properly presented, make good decisions. So in my experience, again, New Jersey, very industrialized, lots of heavy industry, lots of refineries. Pollution was much worse for jobs, and unsafe workplaces were much worse for jobs than environmental regulations. However, I completely understand that analyzing the impacts on the economy on jobs should be part of the decision process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and following your lead, I'll yield back my 46 seconds.
I thank my friend. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
I'm struck, again, I'm learning a heck of a lot in this meeting, so thank you all for all being here. I'm struck how sometimes process is used to manipulate the response to the findings. Now, Dr. Honeycutt, I'm impressed that y'all, I haven't read about a regression coefficient since I've been here, been practicing, whatever. And y'all did an analysis. Now, that's a 1,043-page document, which is stultifying, redundant, and sometimes irrelevant, and yet you had to do all 1,043 pages. Now, it makes me think that it would be hard, it would be an incredibly time-intensive, resource-intensive to really do an adequate review. If you have a statistician doing a regression coefficient on nasopharyngeal cancer mortality to criticize or critique the method by which they determined incidence, you got some money tied up in staff working on this project. Fair statement?
Yes, sir, it is.
Now, is there, if it's 1,000 pages, do they give you 120 days, or you see what I'm saying?
Yes, sir. No, you get the same amount of time. And the deal with IRIS is you don't get to give input on the front end, you give input on the back end. After EPA's already, the train has left the station and they're recalcitrant to change their mind. So that's what you're left with.
I see everybody's nodding their head, yeah. Now, that's disturbing, because again, if we have a premise, which I think you all agree with, is that sometimes they're not given the complete picture, but at the same time, it takes an incredibly intensive process in order to uncover how that is not complete, then you're going to have policy decisions made upon something which may, some cynics would say, deliberately made onerous upon which to review. Again, it goes back to, is science driving policy, or is science being used, presented in such a way as to serve as advocacy for a policy end? Now, we heard in the first panel, and NAS and others criticized the fact that OMB was allowed to at times review the EPA documents in order to say, okay, wait a second, time out, let us look at this. But Dr. Burke, I had a sense from you that in this whole analysis needs to be some sort of cost-benefit, return on investment. What is the true sort of economic cost? Here we have people losing their jobs for something which is nominally and maybe even speciously toxic. Now I'm thinking maybe OMB needs to be involved. I mean, maybe there needs to be a delay if once the train has left the station, you have so little time to review something which is so complex to review. Dr. Clue, what would be your comments on that?
I'm not sure what would be the level of oversight, but I do believe that OMB plays an important role in verifying that the agencies are doing the best job to make the process reviewable. And so I would be in favor of there being a better dialogue between OMB and EPA so that that could be accomplished.
And in fairness, I think the critique is that they should be more transparent in their questions, but I think there was also a criticism as regards sending EPA back to repeat an analysis. What I've learned today is that maybe EPA does need to be sent back to be more inclusive in their analysis. I'm feeling more sympathy for OMB right now. So let's see if there's anything else in this. Now, who's a chemist? Anybody up there a chemist? The idea that Dr. Anastas said that with green chemistry, they know the actual effect of every chemical compound is going to have upon skin, respiratory system, digestive system, etc., seems to me like the epitome of intellectual kind of habri.
It might have been somewhat hyperbolic. I think he is trying to indicate that there's an ability, and drug companies use it all the time, to try to estimate activity from structural properties, and that's trying to be harnessed. They are trying to harness that in order to develop safer compounds.
There's also a presumption, though, that you can make everything inert. And I'm not sure you can make life inert.
I'm fairly confident you cannot.
Yeah, so I agree with that. Let me finish up. I'll also yield back by saying to Mr. Cook, Mr. Cook, you're the only guy in this whole room that creates jobs. So on behalf of the American people, thank you for creating jobs, and I'm very sorry for the impediments put in front of you by the federal government.
We sincerely wish we could be creating a lot more jobs.
Yeah, well, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now recognizes Mr. Harper from Mississippi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today and give your insight into what is continuing to be a very important issue for us. And I'll start, if I may, with you, Dr. Honeycutt, if I could, just with some follow-up questions on what you've had earlier. And I have to ask, what types of evidence are necessary to establish a causal relationship between exposure to a substance and some health effect or health risk?
Yes, sir.
What are you looking for?
Yes, that's a very good question, and it's one it's well known. It's called the Hill criteria for causation. It's well documented. What you need to do is show that a chemical can cause the effect that you're looking at, and it can cause it at the concentrations you're looking at, and that it's reproducible. It happens over and over again, not just one time in one study, and that the effect happens after the exposure. Sometimes we regulate chemicals on the exposure. The effect happened after the exposure, before the exposure. Mm-hmm. And that it's not just a background occurrence, the health effect that you're looking at, that if there's an increased incidence of cancer in this community, that is indeed increased. It's well above background, not just a tiny bit above background.
Are you always able to figure those problems out? It's a search, I'm sure, many times. And
sometimes it happens very easily, and sometimes it's harder. The health effects of ozone are based on a 1 to 4% increase in premature mortality, whatever that is. And how do you quantitate that? It's very, very difficult. And the studies the EPA use, you can't quantitate that.
And is it true that substances at a high level which may create that risk, they may be safe, perhaps even necessary at a low level? Would that be certainly true to say?
Absolutely. Every vitamin you take, most of the minerals in your food that you eat, some of them are essential nutrients, and if you get too much of them, they will kill you.
If I could, Dr. Cook, I wanted to ask you, excuse me.
Mr. Cook.
Mr. Cook, I'm sorry, we're just, that just shows you the respect that we have for your being here today. Earlier today, we had on the first panel, I believe you were in the room when they were here, Mr. Trimble from GAO testified on panel 1 that the EPA should take the IRIS program back in-house to avoid meddling from OMB or other departments or agencies. Based upon your experience, do you think that's a wise move?
If it had not been for OMB's implementation of the Information Quality Act in 2002, I do not believe we ever would have seen IRIS recognize the true chronic effect from barium. 4 years after the 1994 NTP study, the definitive study, was published on barium chronic toxicity, the revised IRIS assessment in 1998 still argued and ignored the sound scientific evidence that there was no blood pressure effect from small, low levels of barium. If it had not been for OMB's intervention, I don't think we ever would have gotten any response from EPA to make the change that was finally put into effect in IRIS in 2005.
Thank you. Also, Mr. Cook, another question I have is there, some concerns about IRIS relate to cleanup levels that must be attained under our federal environmental laws. Do you have any experience where IRIS uncertainty or inappropriate values caused a hazardous waste cleanup to either stall or be delayed, or the costs rise substantially?
We are still in the throes of determining financial responsibility for a Superfund cleanup that is still ongoing in North Carolina. Ward Transformer Company operated just near the Raleigh, North Carolina airport, rebuilding transformers from 1963 until they finally went out of business, I think, in 2004. They were designated as a Superfund site, the plant site there, I think, in about 1979. Some of the potentially responsible parties negotiated a settlement with EPA to clean up the actual plant site. The contamination is all PCBs from transformer oil. And they were given a choice at the time that they came to a settlement with EPA of either cleaning up to a 25 part per million standard or a 1 part per million standard. The consultant that was working with them reported in the document that I obtained from Region 4 EPA that the choice to clean up to a very stringent 1 ppm standard was made primarily because of a fear that EPA would come back later and require a further cleanup, because the safe level had not been clearly defined in IRIS, and they weren't sure what might come down the pike.
So an abundance of caution made them do that at a much greater cost than probably what was necessary.
Yes, I think, well, they even ended up spending about 2.5 times what they thought they were going to spend to clean up to a 1 ppm standard.
I thank each of you, and I yield back.
I thank my colleague for joining, and for you, thank you for putting up with 2 rounds of questionings from us. We really appreciate it, and you can tell from the questions by my colleagues that they were sincere in trying to work through this process. I want to put on the record that the record will be open for 10 days. You all may see some additional written questions, as the first panel might from us. If you could answer those questions in writing and send them back within that period of time or as soon as possible, we would greatly appreciate that. We do appreciate your time and adjourn the hearing. Thanks for letting me go. I mean, I didn't think very many people would show up, so
Yeah.
just for these guys.
It's cool. They came a long way.
Yeah.
We'll get them some for the record, don't worry.
Really?
Well, there were 3 members who wanted to be here, I know, so.
See you, Jackie.
Bye.